Welcome back again to The Realm of Ideas is Free to All. This is episode three, the artificial or aesthetic metaphor. This is a series of talks I give, just kind of like impromptu monologues about ideas that are relatively important to me in terms of my work as an architect and a researcher. Anyway, so we started, I guess, 2 weeks ago with the operation of the metaphor, and I kind of talked briefly about that was. And then last week I talked about the organic metaphor, and I kind of talked about the fact that there was a difference between the process in terms of how we understand it, and maybe a possibility of the fact that it's a larger kind of concept than we believe it. And kind of today I'm going to go over like that we pretty much understand in contrast, but correlated to what I spoke about last week. So I started with this because I think it was a incredibly valuable thing in terms of the fact that it's been very potent in terms of how I think it's kind of correlated to a lot of ideas and kind of made sense as I kind of like saw parallels and analogies and drew relationships with other people and other thought processes and stuff like that. I don't know if it's been clear, but I mean, I'm feel that I owe a great debt to the work of Alfred North Whitehead, Ortega Gasset, and David Hume, uh, to say the most important influences. There are other ones, no doubt, but these, what I would say, are probably those that are the greatest consequence to me. Okay. So anyway, what we spoke about last week was that the metaphor is actually a generative strategy that exists in nature, and it's something that we borrow, and that what our use of it in an artificial sense. Oh, also another, you know, should note this, like one of the greatest influences that I've had is the work of Charles Darwin, and I believe that The Origin of Species was probably, I've read it cover to cover, as well as kind of read portions of it time to time over the course of the last, I think the first time I read it was between my second and third year in architectural school. And was it the second, third, or third and fourth? Anyway, it was one of those things where I kind of took upon myself, or kind of like during the summer, I kind of thought this is a book that I kind of think I kind of need to read. And I remember reading it for the first time, and kind of starting to piece things together. But one of the things that I kind of understood, aside, what felt was important, if I understand it even now, which is unlikely, was the idea of selection, but also more importantly, the idea of artificial and natural, and the idea that like in nature, certain things kind of like come about in terms of what I would call a sense of entanglement or metaphor, but also in terms of the fact that there is an artificial component of selection that we kind of use in terms of what we would call breeding. And that's kind of what I would say is a kind of analogy that I will kind of talk about in relationship to the metaphor, is that there is an organic metaphor and there is an artificial metaphor, or like natural metaphor and artificial. So examples of the natural metaphor were those things that come about as a result of the entanglement of additions to the component parts or functions of properties of an object. And it could be anything from, kind of animate to inanimate objects. Um, I use the example, the fact that like we start with energies, and then from energies, kind of they entangle themselves into particles, and then the particles entangle themselves into different arrangements in terms of atoms, and then they form different elements, and the elements basically entangle, and we go into the sense of kind of like these things get themselves into more complex circumstance from more simple complex circumstance. But the addition of this to this creates that. So that sense of what I would call entanglement is what generates things from simpler things. One of the things I was talked about briefly is the metaphor foreseeable? Now, I'm a secular individual. I don't believe in any God-like character, or kind of like, certainly not in the kind of standard religious cases. But I mean, again, Whitehead basically had a theological component to his work. I don't necessarily ascribe to that, but I just, like there was with Whitehead and with Descartes, there was the need for a source, which was kind of looked upon as God. I mean, can't really go into this in detail because I really don't know it, because I didn't really have the interest to kind of see this, though it does have a kind of fairly large metaphysical component. But anyway, I thought to myself that if there was a foreseeability to metaphor, it would have to be from a position where one could have a perspective of the entirety of nature. And that's not something that a human is capable of. So I think the fact is, I've made the distinction, or maybe I have made the distinction, I should make it here, is the fact that, metaphor acts differently from the algorithm, in the fact that, like, the algorithm basically kind of like has certain things that are contained within the operations of the process, whereas the creation of something metaphorically is not foreseeable. So the thing is, if I have a series of axioms that I kind of use in a kind of logical construction, I can understand the operations as a result of the things that they come from. In a metaphor, that's not necessarily the case. But the question is it conceivably foreseeable? And the answer is something that I still struggle with, because I think it's a kind of component question of the thing itself. But I came recently to this idea that, if possible, it is something where you would have to have an understanding of the totality of all circumstance in order to see all foreseeability. One of the things that is great about the metaphor is the fact that when you put it together, you kind of have a chance to kind of discover all these component things as if kind of it invents itself. So that once the combination is made, it may be made as a kind of sense that there's a speculation that this could be of consequence. But then once you see it, it will reveal itself as you investigate it. But it kind of seems like it can't really be revealed until it actually can be. It can't really be an investigation until it's actually in a case where you can kind of contemplate it. So the contemplation of its generation then leads to an investigation. Now, that's where we are. So now we have this, and now let's think about the idea of the artificial metaphor, or what I would call the aesthetic metaphor. The aesthetic metaphor being the fact that it would deal with the components, if I'm speaking in relation to that which I would say is Whitehead, it would be in relationship to truth and beauty. So in this case, that the metaphor, in a natural sense, would benefit from its ability to generate things that have a resilience that can persist, and the fact that it can reproduce and kind of exist. And in the case of the aesthetic metaphor, it pertains to its consequence in terms of the ability to convey correlation to value in terms of the contemplation of truth or beauty. And we talk about the fact that we think of the things that we do. I mean, if the arrangement of atoms allows us to put together components to create different elements, once I create carbon, I have an arrangement that allows me to create polypeptide chains. So the idea of these two things leads to the idea that carbon allows me to create something I couldn't do previously. I can't make polypeptide chains and amino acids without first having a carbon molecule that I can, the element carbon that I can make molecules with other with other elements. So in the case of that, there's a situation where it gives rise to, the amino acid is a consequence of carbon, and it's a consequence of elements, which is a consequence of particles, which is a consequence of energy. So this, kind of may seem simplistic. It also seems kind of crude because, again, I'm neither a physicist nor a philosopher. I'm an architect, but it probably spent way too much time reading books. So it's not. It's something that kind of allows me to kind of start to think about the things that I make. So, in terms of the nature of this, we talked briefly, I think, in one of the previous episodes about Whitehead's process reality and how he comes to see the fact that, metaphysics changes from this static Greek sense of being to more sense of becoming, in the fact that things don't have a static and unchangeable nature, but basically come into existence as a result of a process and basically maintain themselves as a sense of consequence or value, which I believe was something that he had inherited from his understanding of Hume. And as a result, that means these things entangle and kind of give themselves a value. We'll speak more about that in terms of the next episode, which is called, let's see, it's like the unbreakable bonds or the proto-metaphor, or in this case, maybe the proto-metaphor is not a correct term, but I like the term because it kind of talks about the fact that unbreakable means these are useful things that we find, and they're more societal. And we'll speak, about those things in terms of the facts of what they are. But a quick example is the fact that one of the things we've done in Western society is we have kind of taken our our technique or technology, and we have kind of put it together with science or reason. And as a result, it created a process that allows us to generate artifacts, objects, and ideas that have a certain criteria that are more rigorous than prior to when technique was linked to things that were more, let's see, superstition based. So when I had the fact that I believed that superstition was the things that oversaw, or gods oversaw, the nature of the things that I created, there were certain beliefs that basically stopped me from able to be experimental and test and improve my objects. So that was, I feel, an unbreakable bond of Western society that allows us to attain a certain experimental capacity to test and improve those things that we make and generate new things from past things, which is also inherent in the idea of the metaphor itself. So anyway, that's for next week. I'll give some examples of what other things exist and talk about the kind of existential crisis of when we kind of uncouple these things, because though they are unbreakable, they're not inseparable. And they can be, you can go from a point where something of greater value is erased and replaced by something of lesser value. And that has an interesting or kind of romantic, sentimental attachment to me, because I think about the work of Voltaire and Diderot, especially with the Encyclopedia. And I think also this was something that was inherent, or maybe it's my own bias, when I look at the work of Ortega or Whitehead, and the fact that they felt that there were certain things that needed to be maintained in order for us to kind of continue our progress, if progress was something that could conceivably be achieved and maintained, or potentially advanced. So moving on to that, what we know is the idea of metaphor within language, or metaphor within painting. The idea of kind of symbolism as a result of things that kind of like add from this idea that, something is something unto itself, in terms of it has a similarity which allows it to connect to something that allows it to maintain its identity. So an example would be the glass bottle fascination idea of Julie Rauer, or Ortega's idea of the cypress as the ghost of a dead flame, and the fact that these similarities give rise to identities that are results of the taking of these concepts and bringing them together to form new concepts. So the cypress ghost of a flame is a real thing that exists in a psychic realm that allows us to understand the similarity between these things that exist in our mind. When we see this in our mind, we simultaneously see the flame, the ghost, and the cypress. But we never see these things in real life because they don't exist simultaneously. They exist as a kind of reality that we use conceptually. And the same in terms of the glass bottle fascination and the fact that, like, the idea of this fascination that comes from glass bottles that allows us to kind of start to think about this object as a kind of potential in the reliquary. I mean, the church used crystal as reliquary, and in fact, it became somewhat of a kind of like revered, even scandalous reality in the case that the idea of the images that can be conjured from reflections and refractions in even homogeneous or more likely in non-homogeneous quantities and materials were quite kind of like provocative in the way in which they existed. So in this case, the reliquary was a kind of like hallucinogenic object that allowed you to see and have visions because you literally looked in with your bias or your kind of like objective or your subjective, reality, and saw, as we have this natural potential to start to see patterns to try to understand the world in which we live. So that selective reality that we use to kind of like kind of sustain ourselves, right, with something that was utilized. In the case, we still utilize it today. We see clouds and we see faces in the clouds, or in the case of what I'm talking about, the religious individuals saw these objects that could have been the idea of the divinity or related to the divinity. But this was the case in which these things start to emanate and exist, within themselves and then outside themselves. So we see these things as part of, again, that idea of something coming into being and having utility. Like we use the example of a map. A map has does a map completely tell the truth? It's like we don't believe that the map completely tells the truth, but the map has a certain utility in that it allows us to kind of like move within certain places that we believe we know to exist, and allows us to kind of track back and forth to those locations. So we think, okay, 6 miles from here, following this road and following that road will take us to this location. So we start to use these things because they have a utility that allow us to kind of cover ground. So that's basically the essence of that. And I think that we I spoke briefly about um, Bronowski's critique of Chomsky and his piece on Cartesian language, where he kind of talked about the fact that once we remove ourselves from instinct, that we could separate ourselves and identify a language that was completely separate from um, animal language. And I feel that that whole issue is somewhat moot in relationship to the metaphor, as relates to the fact that the analogy is not in terms of communication, it's in relation to generation. So it's the generation of concepts that is just an inherent part of the natural world, and it exists in innate as well as as innate and objects. So that's basically my premise. So my premise is, like, non-organic and organic life is also capable of being generative in terms of this process that we would see. And like, I think I gave the example of the Carl Sagan snippet where he has a video where he kind of has a simple line drawing that shows certain things that happen, and as the certain modifications are made, certain capabilities take place, and then this permutation that brings us all the way through the kind of like the family tree of organisms. So that's pretty much what I wanted to cover here, in the fact that we if there is an aesthetic or an artificial component, it's primarily the use of the metaphor in the pursuit of the understanding of truth and beauty. And if they're, the artificial, just like the artificial uh, selection is used for a specific purpose within a value relative to the organisms that create that artificial consequence. Um, that would be that in relationship to the metaphor. That the metaphor in this case, being artificial, is used for the most part within our art and literature to generate things within that aspect that we would call beauty or truth. And in my case, we'll get to it later, what I would add as a result of readings of Ortega, specifically in terms of the work of the metaphor and phenomenology, and his critique of Leibniz, it would be that which would also include love as a kind of unifier. Anyway, so that's where we are. I think this was this was actually felt, and when I started, I kind of felt like this was not going to be as clear and as easy as I thought, but actually it turned out to be quite good. All right, we ran a little bit longer. I'm looking again to get between 15 and 20 minutes, and I'm kind of now at 21. Anyway, so that's the case. Next week, we're going to be talking about unbreakable bonds, the proto-metaphor, which is, I believe, a kind of cultural, sociological aspect of this idea. I guess it would also be an aspect of the artificial metaphor, because it's something that, and we'll talk about this in relationship to, Whitehead, in terms of his idea of civilization and the idea that it is something that kind of moves from a series of kind of simple to more complex, like almost like we have with the the natural world. But in terms of the fact that we have certain desires, and that's desire for civilization it's not inevitable, but it is something that we can aspire to and to control to some degree. And I think the construction of the unbreakable bonds is something we can look at and analyze and see which ones exist or which ones are important, and how some give rise to others over time. So with that said, we will kind of like close for now. And in the case there where we have our closing, we are going to say that the realm of ideas is free to all, and it's to all of our benefit to keep it this way. Thank you, and we'll see you soon.